Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CRCW presentations. I'm your Vice Provost, Jessie Smith. I use she, her pronouns, and I want to first acknowledge that this land on which we sit together is collectively today is stolen land from our Indigenous peoples. People always want to learn about what's going on at UCCS from our faculty and researchers and our staff researchers and our student researchers. And inevitably, they beg for a forum where they can get small snippets to understand the expertise that we have on our campus. And we also know that it's incredibly difficult to carve out the time to do that, where it works both for the researcher as well as for the audience member. So this is our attempt to bring the campus community a forum in which we are recording, camera one, and that you can come back to time and time again, fast forward, skip around, revisit. So really we're creating a digital footprint available to our current and our future generation of scholars who want to learn more about what's going on at UCCS. The CRCW program is pretty special, started in 2010. CRCW, in case you were curious, stands for the Committee on Research and Creative Works. It's a seed grant program. We've been giving out over 170 to date and almost $1 million since it started. Awards have been granted to every college on campus with a unique and exciting blend of work supported across ranks, across fields, and across ways of knowing and ways of doing. Projects go on for the CRCW to keep the funding alive. The goal is to prepare our scholars to collect that pilot data or just sort of proof of concept, whatever they might need that will lead to future funding so that we can invest those funds from F&A back into the seed grant program. So it's a beautiful cycle when done well. Research is such an integral part of our UCCS community and our mission. And so with that, I just want to start with our first set of presentations. And our first speaker is Ezio Ayakoko, who's going to come on up and get us started.
All right, thank you very much. So yeah, my presentation is on nano-design magnetic materials towards energy efficient and fast technologies. That's better. All right, so I'm Ezio Ayakoko, assistant professor at the Department of Physics and Energy Science. I already my title. So let me start by talking to you about my group. So it has grown quite a lot since I started. So I have now 5 graduate students, 2 undergraduate students. Casey is an undergraduate who graduated. He's actually coming back as a graduate student, so hopefully in my group again. The person that was supported by this CRCW program was Ali Roxborough, mostly. She was one of my first students in the group. So it started in 2021. So let me just give you, I just want to give you an idea of what this is about. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just give you the gist of it. So the idea is that we want to control quasi-particles. And okay, what's a quasi-particle and why we want to do this? Let's start with something a little bit more tangible, which is an actual particle. So semiconductors is something that we are accustomed to. Maybe we haven't done all the theory and solved this, but we know what semiconductors are. They're all in all the processors we have in our devices. And basically, it has worked because we have transistors. And transistors basically allow you to control electrons. That's the main point. Why they allow you to control electrons? This is kind of the picture I put in the proposal. And I think it's an intuitive representation. So imagine that all these balls are the electrons. And they basically have 2 states in the semiconductor material. So it can either be static or parked here, or they can either be conducting. And in between, there's a gap where they cannot do either. So I thought it looks like a lane where you have to cross. But you can't be in that lane. It's illegal. They can't do that. So it's either here or there. So that's the idea. That's how semiconductors work. Why this works? In one sentence is because semiconductors have a very special crystalline structure. And that makes you think, well, is there any other structure that can have something analogous to it? And it can, and this is my favorite example, which is a butterfly. So if you ever play with butterflies and you touch their wings, you probably see that they lose their color, but you don't get anything in your finger, like you would do with moths, right? And just spill a bunch of horrible stuff. So the, oops, I You want to check that? All right. So the point is that the wings of a butterfly actually look like this when you look at it in a microscope, and they have this very special pattern. And that pattern, it's just like a semiconductor in the sense that there is a prohibited gap that where, in this case, photons or light cannot conduct. And so that gap is actually in the blue light. So all that light is reflected blue to your eyes. The rest is absorbed by the wing. So that's an example where you can pattern media and get some behavior. And this gave rise to the field of photonic crystals. That's how you can do things with photons. So what I'm interested about is magnetic crystals. So do the same with magnons. And magnons is what we call a quasi-particle. It's not really a real particle, but it's something we can interpret as a particle. And this has been going on for a while. So magnetics is a big field of research. The main advantage is that it has little heating through it. And this was one proposal of a magnon transistor back in 2015. So I wanted to build on this, but we wanted to make it more like a semiconductor. That was the main idea. This took a little while, but I'm almost done with that. That's the main thing. So let me show you the results of what Ali managed to publish. So what we proposed was a periodic modification of magnetic parameters. And again, this is just a schematic. There are two configurations we care about, the forward volume wave, surface waves. The main point here is that you put a magnetic field in either direction, and this red and white contrast means that there's some magnetic parameters that we're changing in some periodic fashion. Really what we want ultimately is a wave, and the wave has a dispersion relation. So a quick reminder, you have a wavelength. The wavelength is also expressed as 2 pi over k. K is a wave number. That's what you see here. So that tells you what kind of wave is propagating. And this is all we want, the angular frequency versus a wave number. If we can understand that function, then we know if we have this structure of a semiconductor. And long story short, we did find that. This is our main result, and this was published earlier this year. So this is when we modified a parameter called exchange stiffness. And basically, the red lines here are analytical calculations that we did, and the black and white contrast is numerical simulations. And they agree sort of well. I mean, we could have done better, but it was not necessary because all we wanted to know was whether we get this band gap. So here I'm highlighting in red. It's not super clear, but this probably makes it even clearer. So this is, you excite a wave and you make it pass through this material. If you're at 24 or 20 gigahertz, so here or up here, you're not in the band gap and the waves go all the way through, and this is about 2 microns. In this range, you can see that the waves quench really quickly. So that's what we call a evanescent wave. So okay, it's not completely prohibited, but they are quenched very, very quick. So we were happy with this. We actually found the band gap. And that was one of the main thrusts of this CRCW. So we're moving forward. And what we want to do now is a magnon junction. Why a junction? Because that's an LED, basically. We want to do a magnon LED. So basically, you have two materials. You put them together. And what you do, well, it didn't align you very well, but it's better. So now they're better aligned. And the thing is that you have two band gaps that are staggered. And that's really the principle of how this works. And semiconductors, that's how you do a light-emitted diode or a diode in general. So basically, what we want to know is, okay, what happens if I put a wave from this side? It probably goes this way. If I come from the other side, it will get trapped, or it can't pass through this band gap, and the other way around to the bottom. So we're investigating this. This is really, really recent results. So this is a plot that Ali plotted last week. So it's really recent. And this is what I think is the first step toward a transistor analogy. So we have, this is the junction in blue, and you see that there's you see. What this is the input output over input. So what is the output here compared to this wave? And you can see that the wave gets completely suppressed or very strongly suppressed earlier than it will be otherwise in the single material one. So what we want to move towards is doing what is called a quantum well. So put material 1, 2, 1 again, and hopefully that will allow a single wave to go through, so we can have some sort of magnet laser or something like that. So anyway, we're excited about it and see what happens. So that was the main idea of the proposal. There's a clock here. Okay, good. So I'm halfway through. So I guess the other thing that matters is, what do we do with this? So funding, that was one of the outcomes, as Jesse said. The main idea was, in this proposal, was to send a joint proposal with the UKRI and NSF. This is a really nice UK and US program. So I had collaborators in the UK, Paul Keathley in Exeter, and Liam O'Brien in Liverpool. So we sent our pre-proposal. Fortunately, that was rejected. What we did was learn that there is a very different way to interpret engineering in the US and the UK. So it's not that we sent a proposal, we sent our pre-proposal, and they said it doesn't really agree with our program. NSF said it was fine, but UK said it wasn't. So anyway, we learned our lesson. Turns out this is physics in the UK and it's engineering in the US. So anyhow. Another one was to send an NSF proposal to engineering, and that actually worked. However, this was sent basically at the same time of the CRCW. So great news, but we didn't really apply anything of what we have done here. But Ali was still supported with this NSF, and that also helped to know how the program works. And now we're getting these results and hopefully send a proposal later on or a renewal to this proposal. So that was fun, that worked. The other outcome is training to the students. So like I said, Ali was the main person supported. So she had a whole lot of opportunities. She had a booster presentation in Magnonics. This is an international conference. It was held in California at that time. She presented twice the Monoline Research Day, and one of them she was a finalist for a scholar. She also presented in France, which stands for Front Range Advanced Magnetic Symposium. This is a yearly regional conference of magnetism in Colorado. Actually, this summer is going to be here in UCCF, so me and Dima are organizing it. Dima Boschko, yeah, for those who don't know him by his first name. She also had oral presentations. She was actually a finalist in the 3-minute talk with this work. She also did her comprehensive exam and passed, which is great. Another nice two opportunities that she could go to the IEEE Magnetic Summer School. This is called a school, but it's really a little conference for students, and they have talks by experts. So it's a really nice opportunity to learn about magnetism. And she lucked out because this was in Italy, and they get funding for them to go. So she had a good time. And there in Italy, she also could meet Professor Monticello, and then she arranged to visit the University of Ferrara. She also gave a physics lecture in the department. And that was good. That started a new collaboration with them, and we're actually working together. Actually, his student, Pietro Micheletti, came here to visit. So he stayed here for 2-3 months, and now we have one paper in progress and hopefully another one. This one of Magnet Junction will be with them as well. So it's good. We had some collaborations going. What else I wanted to say? I guess that's the conclusion. We demonstrated that this idea worked. We had pattern magnetic circuits. We hope we really can use it as quasi-particle analogs and have some sort of magnet laser. Yeah, we're currently investigating this magnetic junction. We hope to submit it to physical review applied. And results from this NSF, like I said, it was slightly different. This was an artificial spin ISIS, but Ali participated in this paper that she wrote, which is basically on the CRCW grant, and this other paper with another of my students, Gannon, and we had some other papers. And also, you know, all of this also helps to build your research and all of that. So also was awarded the Early Career Award for DOE. We already have a preprint going on that just got accepted. Yeah, it's going well with funding. So I guess that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next speaker will be Matt Quinlan. Come on up and we'll switch over the presentations here. How did you know? Just giving away a free pass for all the secrets are embedded in the CRCW.
All right, allergy season, yeah, bear with me. I'm Assistant Professor Matt Quinlan in the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department, and our proposal was on secondary hydrodynamic instabilities and their role in liquid fuel atomization. Okay, yeah, great, we'll get to what that means maybe. This work was, this grant went towards supporting 3 students partially. Joseph Day, Santiago Arazo, and Samarth. His last name right. And you see some funding agencies here. This is kind of the direction that we're trying to go for looking at funding for this work. So I wanted to get a little overview of just kind of our background, what we do in the lab. So I call it the combustion and acoustics lab, but we do more than just that. I have many years of experience working on sprays and for fuels especially, so both in the diesel world and kind of the rocket and gas turbine world. And so we look at sprays like this. I've worked on hydraulic hybrids for different applications. We are doing more and more work. We've done a lot in acoustics, but now we're doing more in shocks and detonations, partly to support our colleagues at USAFA at the Air Force Academy. So some of this, for example, this is a simulation we're running right now for them that we'll be working with them this summer on. We're also developing new ways of making computational fluid dynamics simulations, especially for multi-phase flow, and getting some really good results with that. We have a physics of fluids paper out, and we're going with the JFM one now, and we have a couple of combustion and flame papers that have come out of that work. Actually, a lot of stuff looking at burning of solid propellants, which isn't something I planned on working on 3 years ago, right? You never know. And so like this is some stuff that's off the press. This was didn't work 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so Emma just actually defended her PhD 2 weeks ago. So yeah, very, very nice. And then we also do things like combustion dynamics, and that's kind of one of the, we're trying to kind of combine the spray stuff with the combustion dynamics work we do, and also then use our data analysis techniques that we've been developing over the years to, essentially extract useful information from these diagnostics rather than just pretty pictures. Thank you so much. Okay, so most of the work that we do in the lab is centered somehow around combustion instabilities and combustion dynamics. So we'll look at that first and say kind of maybe why we're doing it and what the bigger picture is. And then we'll specifically look at this project and how looking at spray atomization is involved in that and what we're hoping to build towards as we look at this kind of longer term project. Okay, so let's start with the combustion instabilities. When we look at like a rocket engine or a gas turbine engine, a combustion instability is the feedback coupling between combustion heat release and specifically unsteady combustion heat release. Essentially gives an unsteady expansion of the gases. So that causes acoustic waves. Essentially you get sound from that. That sound then looks like a perturbation to the velocity field, the pressure field. It can cause mixing changes that are oscillatory. And so really that's kind of the one that we're looking at in this project. And we're looking at how those can influence the combustion to make it unsteady. So if you get so that this creates one of these and it just keeps going, and if it is a positive feedback, it gets bigger and bigger each cycle. And in a rocket engine, you have a few milliseconds to turn it off before you've got a hole in your rocket, and it's not a rocket anymore. So, but it's very strange. These are very big oscillations, and these are very, very small oscillations. So for a long time, this is how we looked at it, but maybe in the last 15 years or something, we said, well, there's got to be something, there's got to be a mechanism by which these small perturbations over here can make these large perturbations here. And this comes with hydrodynamics, understanding how the fluid shear layers and coherent structures interact and essentially can influence this larger combustion field on a whole. It turns out that these are very, very sensitive in certain locations to even small perturbations. So that's where our focus is. So these have happened in basically every liquid rocket engine development program, maybe save a few. And we're trying to essentially get at the fundamental physics behind those and so to see if we can essentially help designers design new techniques for design. Okay, so specifically what we're looking at is, okay, there's lots of injectors, lots of rockets, lots of other propulsion devices use liquid injectors and to atomize the fuel so that we can essentially get it into a vapor, which then can be mixed with other propellants and then burn. And we can imagine that if this thing was oscillatory for some reason, that would cause oscillations in the combustion process. Okay, so fundamentally understanding how this thing works must be at least somewhat important. So we have focused on a style of injector called a outwardly opening pintle injector. So here's a typical rocket bipropellant injector style injector here on the left. So here's the center line. Here's the pintle, if we call it. It's got kind of a little outward mushroom shape, and it opens by going down. So you can control the gap here by controlling the position of this. And so these injectors are also throttleable, which is very unusual for injectors. Usually most injectors work best, they atomize best under very few conditions. So this is kind of interesting. It gives us a lot of flexibility. And the other thing that's been interesting about these is that they've been relatively stable. And so that's put them in favor for some very, very critical applications like the lunar landers. So Apollo's lunar lander used injectors just like this, whereas most lift type rockets don't use them. So in this case, there's one propellant coming through here, and maybe there's a second propellant here. And the shear that's induced by the two different velocities of the different fluids can cause instabilities in addition to the shear layers on either side of the fluid, like the liquid gas interface and their different shear properties. So we've got these potentials for shear here and our hydrodynamic instabilities that we're looking at. We want to make it even simpler. And so we looked at specifically a single propellant case where we just essentially erased this outside one and said, well, let's just look at this. And you can still use these as a rocket injector by having a co-flow of, say, like if this is fuel and have a co-flow of oxidizer, that you can essentially use this by itself. Or you can have this as a monopropellant, something that thermo decomposition is exothermic enough that it can sustain the combustion process, essentially. And there are propellants that are like that. So we've kind of said, okay, well, let's try to actually build something that looks like this and see if we can actually get it to work and see if we can understand how those shear layers work. The goal is, well, if we can make a really nice smooth liquid sheet, and so that we can have access to looking at, say, its surface, then we can look at the instabilities that are on it. And typically what happens is the first thing, you have a very nice smooth liquid sheet, and then you get a kind of primary instability that is often two-dimensional and very nice and smooth. But then as you go along, that becomes a new base state, if you will, and a secondary instability develops on it, which is typically very three-dimensional and very violent. So shortly after this first instability forms, then somewhere a secondary instability forms, which causes very large oscillations in the sheet and can put enough energy into that sheet that actually causes the sheet to break. And typically the first thing that happens is that sheet breaks into a ligament, so a long string of liquid, and then that ligament itself is unstable and further breaks into very small droplets that can evaporate very quickly and mix very quickly and burn very quickly. So this is the goal. We actually want to do two things with this. We want to see, well, can we just first understand this how these secondary instabilities play this important role in it, breaking this up at this point. It turns out to be a very critical, this part of the atomization happens very, very quick. And further, can we maybe in the long term control it? So can I do something like oscillate this liquid mass flow just a little bit at just the right frequency to cause this primary and secondary instability to happen much quicker, or happen more violently, or something like that, so that we can make the atomization even better. This would expand the range of the throttleability that we can have in the injectors. So that's kind of. So we designed up a rig. We figure out here's the pintle. There's an annulus around here where the fluid comes in. This is a fiber optic cable that we'll be using for diagnostics, and we'll show kind of what we're going to do with that in a minute. That's one of the topics that we're working on right now. We actually built the parts, and one of the keys was keeping this piece concentric with this bore very, very closely, so that the annular gap around this piece is very, very uniform. So we spent a lot of time working things out, how to do that, and I think we have the concentricity down in the 40 micron range or something. For electronics folks, that seems like a mile, right? But for us mechanical folks, that's pretty small. So here's a image of the injector operating. This is using water as a faux propellant, right? Safety third always. And so the injector is over here on the left-hand side, and you can see it basically looks like a little garden spray cone that you have. And you can further see there's a sheet, and it looks relatively smooth here. Maybe you can start to see little bumps here. And then very, very quickly, you can see that the sheet breaks up into ligaments, and there's holes. And then by the point you're down here, you can see that they're very small droplets. Okay, and it looks relatively uniform, which is good. This is actually what we call shadowgraph. This is using a bright light source that's basically parallel rays, and as it goes through the liquid, the index of refraction changes, right? And so we can see if the light goes through essentially normal through the liquid, there's no steering of the light, but over here on the edge, there's a lot of steering of the light as it bends around there. And so we can get a good idea of where this is. So we're actually looking at a solid flat sheet, essentially white material, and the light's coming through it. So it's a through the thickness measurement. So there's a couple things that we didn't expect here. These holes, it's actually not something that's reported very well, that there's holes in sheets like this, at least in these kind of the Weber number, the kind of conditions that we have here. It's a relatively low Weber number here, so that everything is very large on scale. So we took this, we did image processing on a bunch of these images. We found contours. We could find the contours that are inside, and the main contour that represents kind of the biggest piece of the sheet that we could. We located places where the occurrence of these contours happened closest to the injector, the furthest from the injector, and started plotting those out and started making statistics from them so that we could kind of understand this. We're limited to essentially relatively low speed acquisition with this work currently, and so statistics is kind of one of our best bets. Ultimately, we're interested in the dynamics, so we need time resolved flow of this. So this takes us to some of the laser diagnostics that we're working on. This is from a PhD done a couple years ago for a jet and crossflow. So there was flow from bottom to from top to bottom here, and there was liquid being injected in, and that liquid was doped with a fluorescent dye, essentially. And then a laser was pulsed through there, and what happens is the liquid fluoresces. We'll talk about that in a second, and it fluoresces just where the sheet is continuous, because once you get past there, the laser light is scattered, and you don't have very good, this light, this liquid out here isn't hit very strongly with the laser, so it doesn't fluoresce very much. So it gives us a good way of quantifying this sheet. In this case, it was a jet, but we're interested in looking at the sheet. So, I mean, not all of us are quantum physics, so we do things like looking at how the fluorescence works. What happens is we excite it with the laser, it vibrationally relaxes, and then we have this spontaneous emission. And this happens in such a way that we can filter this. And so we did a couple of things here. We had to pick a fluorescent dye that would work and optics that worked with it. But ultimately, one of the things that drove it was it had to be soluble in water, and it had to be safe. And so there's not very many dyes that are not horribly toxic. And so we ended up finding this fluorescein and doing tests on it, and we're able to fluoresce it in the lab and make progress on that. And some of the outcomes that we've had from this is we've submitted a NSF MRI for about $1.2 million for high-speed diagnostics equipment to support this, basically the high-speed lasers and high-speed cameras to do this kind of work. And then just recently, we've submitted a white paper to the Office of Navy Research, Naval Research, on which I was a co-PI, basically to take this injector, do experiments here, hot fire testing maybe in Alabama, and computational work at University of Cincinnati, and then also maybe take it to the X-ray beamline at Argonne to do essentially look at the flow through the injector, like while it's going through that gap. This is kind of neat stuff. And we have published at least one conference paper on this work, even though it's mostly preliminary work. But we plan on continuing this work and getting journal articles out of it. So, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Our final speaker in our session 1 is Karen Larkin.
Okay, so we're gonna sort of switch gears a little bit here. Mine is not as technical, I suppose. I'm actually going to be talking about some research very local here in Colorado Springs, in fact, here on campus. I don't know how many of you know that our campus used to be a tuberculosis sanatorium. It was originally designed as a tuberculosis sanatorium. It was conceived of in 1904 by a local physician named Edwin Sully, who convinced General Palmer to give him $50,000 and the land here that we're sitting on to develop a new type of tuberculosis sanatorium, one that focused on sort of traditional at the time healing practices, which included things like exposure to lots of fresh air. Of course, it's fresh air at 7,000 feet, so we have to keep that in mind. Lots of fresh air, rest, and good food. They didn't actually have sort of medical chemical treatments yet for tuberculosis. So they tried what they could. What we're going to be looking at today, and this you're looking at Cragmore Sanatorium in its second iteration. The building you guys now know as Main Hall was built actually in 1914 Edwin Sully created his tuberculosis sanatorium. It was built in 1906. He died in 1907 of tuberculosis. And then they brought in a new doctor named Dr. Forrester, who convinced the board to build at the time, a 3-story sanatorium, which you guys now know is main hall. The top floor at the time was a sunning garden where people would expose themselves, mostly fully unclothed, to the sun, which they believed would help kill the tuberculosis germs. So I decided I was going to focus on the final decade of the tuberculosis sanatorium. So some of you who might be into public health might know that after World War II, penicillin became widely available, treated tuberculosis quite effectively. And so sanatoriums started to fall out of use. However, in certain populations, and Native American populations is one of those, they did not have ready access to the antibiotics. And so the tuberculosis continued to flourish. And so what they did was they coordinated with the newly formed Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to treat tuberculosis patients at former sanatoriums. And so Cragmore Sanatorium contracted with the Navajo Nation and the federal government to treat Navajo patients. Now, you're wondering, what am I doing with this? I'm an archaeologist. And so one of the things that I was looking at was, can we look at the archaeology here on campus to determine what are some of the tensions that we see between traditional medical treatments as well as alternative practices for treating Navajo patients. And how does our colonial history, especially here in the Southwest, impact how institutions are treating Navajo tuberculosis patients? So in the 1950s, the first Navajo patients came to Cragmore Sanatorium. They treated women and girls. They separated men from women Navajo patients, and they brought women and girls up to Cragmore to treat them. And as part of their treatment, so you can see here, this is from the Colorado Springs Gazette, and I believe it's 1954. Cragmore Health Hogan. And you can see here there are a couple of women with their relatives coming to visit. So they brought women up from Navajo Nation and children if they were deemed healthy enough. So they classified them based on how ill they were. If they were deemed healthy enough, and that would be classes 3, 4, 5, and 6, they were able to participate in additional programs that were designed to not just treat the illness, but also teach Navajo how to sort of better hygiene practices, as well as teach them things like English and say homemaking skills. And this is part of their occupational therapy program that was run by occupational therapist named Virginia Dykstra. So you can see that some of the Navajo patients liked some of the traditional ways of doing things better. And so if you look at this, this here is a excerpt from the Navajo patient newsletter that they created called The Corn and the Rainbow. And they talk about the superiority of using traditional soap, which was yucca root, and especially in hair washing. Allergies, whoever mentioned that, whatever's in these trees is killing me. And so they talk about the fact that they would dig out the yucca root, they would use that as the soap, they would wash their hair, make their hair nice and shiny, it would keep it, from turning gray. If you read it down at the bottom, I don't have any other reason not to. But the sanatorium sort of encouraged these sort of traditional practices alongside of teaching sort of more of the Western practices in an attempt to educate Navajo patients so that then when they went back to the reservations, they could teach these within their communities and within their networks. And so part of what they did was they taught a cooking school. And so my question was, can we see, we have some of this recorded here in our archival record. Can we see this in the archaeological record? And can we get a feel for how Navajo patients were responding to these health, education, and welfare programs that the government was imposing on them as part of the treatment for tuberculosis. So you can see some of the women here learning to cook in one of the cottages that would have been behind Main Hall, that have all been torn down now. As you can, well, except for, no, they've all been torn down now, except for a couple of them that are currently lived in that are owned privately. So what we did was we literally dug around in the midden, which is a fancy word for trash, related to the cottages. And lo and behold, we did find some evidence of this. This here that you're looking at is, I know it looks like a muffin tin, but if you look at the scale, it's actually quite small. It's only about this big. And what you're actually looking at is a butter mold. So they would bring in dairy products from a local dairy. The treatments is called stuffing. So they sort of fed these people like really rich diets of dairy. They drink like 3-4 quarts of milk a day, eat like 12 eggs and like 3 pounds of meat to try to sort of build their strength back up. And so, they taught them how to make butter with fancy butter molds. They also taught them English. And if you look at some of the newspaper articles at the time, this was a big push on the Navajo Nation, but they also wanted to have some control over the education that their children were getting. And so you can see some of that tension that I mentioned here, where Navajos want to play a role in their education, but you can also see this is here at Cragmore Navajo Sanatorium, school pupils are voluntarily completing their homework assignments because they're so excited about learning this. So you can see some of that sort of weird tension there that I was mentioning. They also ran a arts program to sort of treat the whole person. Okay, so they did this as part of the occupational therapy program. They encouraged actual traditional art forms like Navajo weaving. And this here is a rug that was accessioned by the Fine Arts Center at Colorado College. That was made by patients here at Cragmore. They would enter their work into fairs, like craft fairs, Indian fairs, down throughout the Southwest, win prizes. In the archives, we have all of their first prize ribbons and their second and third prize ribbons. But they also taught them other forms like beading, which is not a traditional Navajo form. And you can see here bead work that was worn by this bear at one of the beauty contests, as well as they made these sort of key fobs from, this is one of the templates that they had. Here is a note from the archives asking for more beads of this color, which I realize you can't see all that well because of the lighting. And these are all in the collection at the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. And so what they would do is they would encourage them to participate in these. They would also sell the products that they made and use that money then to continue the program. So there's still a tension between the traditional medicinal practices and Western medicinal practices. And there are all kinds of veiled comments that we see in the archives of patients sneaking out and disappearing for a few days or a week at a time. We think, maybe to go home or to also participate in some traditional healing practices, which one of the newsletters gives us a hint of that. Sort of, this is much easier on my screen, but these are 2 pages out of The Corn in the Rainbow. You can see that this traditional medicine helps kill the TB germs. But if you look at this article that they wrote, they talk about, this is what our ancestors did. And it talks about the actual practices that they would use within the healing ceremonies. And then they mention that they're proud to keep these traditions alive because this type of medicine also helps to heal the TB. So you're still seeing this tension being practiced and the sort of hedging their bets just in case the Western medicine didn't work. They're still accessing the traditional healing practices here. How's it working? I might have skipped one there. Oh yes, and we also found evidence of traditional medicinal practices. Look here. This is one of the little cough syrup bottles that we found in the bin. You can see the little graduated marks here, the sides in cc's and the sides in ounces. And so, you can see some cough syrup. You probably recognize mentholatum. So we're using this right now, as well as this is a Vicks Vapor Rub. This is a mentholatum jar that we found out here. We also did some other things. There's lots of alcohol out there as well, by the way. So what are the outcomes of this research that I participated in? We do have an article called Chasing the Cure, Cragmore Sanatorium, or the Archaeology of Tuberculosis Sanatorium, that was published just last year in Historical Archaeology. Did write a NEH collaboration grant with the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum to do additional research on this to help augment their Story of Us website related to tuberculosis. Unfortunately, that was not funded. It was ranked highly, but for some reason we didn't get funded for it, so that's kind of a bummer. However, we're still continuing that collaboration, and I'll be working with the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum while I'm on sabbatical next year to do some additional work on that. I also applied to and participated in an NEH Summer Institute on Public Health that was combining history and public health. And so it was a really interesting format, in that half the participants were public health practitioners and half of them were historians that looked at public health. I was the only archaeologist there. but it was a great blend of people. There was a lot of sort of fun and new innovative ideas that came out of that. That collaboration is sort of continuing. They have written another a grant for another NEH Summer Institute, not this summer, but the following summer, which they've asked me to come back and participate in as a scholar in resident for. So I'm excited to be doing that. And then I'll also be this next spring, so this time next year, you guys are hanging around campus and go out to the Heller Center. I'm going to be the Heller in residence, and I'll be working on doing some more of this additional research. We'll have a presentation out there on what it is that I learned.
Thanks so much to our session 1. We are going to take about a 10-minute break and come back for session 2 at 11. And if you at any point want to grab some snacks, now's a great time. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the CRCW presentations. I'm your Vice Provost, Jessie Smith. I use she, her pronouns, and I want to acknowledge that this land on which we sit at together collectively today is stolen land from our Indigenous peoples. People always want to learn about what's going on with our researchers at UCCS, the fabulous scholarship and creative work on our campus, and this is a particularly good forum to do that. The CRCW, if you are curious, stands for the Committee on Research and Creative Work. And this program has been around since 2010, and collectively we've given out approximately 170 seed grants at the tune of $1 million. Projects supported by the CRCW across all of the colleges, departments, different fields, across ranks, across ways of knowing, ways of doing. And so we're really thrilled with the program that supports a wide breadth of different types of research on our campus. The goal of the CRCW is to position our faculty to get the pilot data, collect that proof of concept, to try something out that prepares them to then be competitive for future funding. Why is that? Because the entire CRCW program is funded through what we call F&A, and so we need the cycle to keep continuing in order to keep funding. So what you're going to see today are some of those outcomes that result in publications, presentations, student engagement, and sometimes even some of that grant funding. So without further ado, I want to get us started with our session 2, and our first speaker today is Katie Busby.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about what I have essentially worked on for the last 2 academic years. So the title of my presentation in the CRCW grant was Mentoring in Academic Nursing from the Perspectives of Faculty Mentors. I am an assistant professor in the Helen and Arthur E. Johnson College, or Helen and Arthur E. Johnson Beth L. College of Nursing and Health Sciences. So a quick background, because I often get asked the question, like, why mentoring? How did you come upon this topic? So I always like to start that by kind of answering the question, what is mentoring? So mentoring theory was developed in the early 1980s by Kathy Cram, who was an organizational psychologist. And so when I work with my research, this is typically the theory that I reference is Cram's theory. So she defines mentoring as a relationship between a more experienced mentor and a less experienced protege or mentee for the purpose of helping and developing a protege's career. Mentoring is typically long-term. She defines it as usually between 3 to 5 years, but it can, of course, be different based on the relationship, and it includes career and psychosocial development. So why mentoring and why nursing? So most people are familiar, there is a nursing shortage across the United States, but in addition to that nursing shortage, we also have a very growing and looming faculty shortage. So our faculty vacancy across the United States is hovering around 9%, and that continues to increase with each year. Because we have a shortage of faculty, we then cannot admit as many qualified students as we would like to, because we just don't have enough to teach. So what do we do about it? Well, mentoring has been identified as a strategy for faculty recruitment and retention. And so it all kind of builds on each other. So my dissertation study several years ago focused on protege or mentee among our new faculty mentors, or among our new faculty. And when we got that data and disseminated it, we kind of were like, okay, well, that's only one half of the relationship. We really need to be looking at the other half as well. And so our experienced faculty who serve as mentors really are role models, and they help promote career development in our new faculty. So when we look at the research in nursing, most of that mentoring research focuses on protege experiences and their outcomes. It doesn't really look at our mentors and our experienced faculty. So with that, then you add workplace stressors on top of it, faculty shortages, heavy workloads. And so we really wanted to explore and better understand how nurse faculty mentors experienced mentoring in the context of their faculty roles in academia. So just 2 slides on method. So the overall purpose was to create a theoretical framework that describes how mentoring relationships in academic nursing unfold from the perspectives of faculty mentors. We used Charmaz's constructivist grounded theory methodology because we wanted to look at a psychosocial problem, which is mentoring, and process among a group. And in this instance, the group was our experienced faculty mentors. So we came up with an 11-question semi-structured interview guide to help guide our qualitative interviews. So we actually had very good response rate. And I will share at the end, we had so much data that we were able to get a second publication out of it as well. So we were able to interview 24 full-time nurse faculty mentors from all over the United States. 22 women and 2 men, and that is typically in line with the demographics you see among nurses, with an average age of 55. And part of our, part of our requirements were that they had to be a mentor to novice nurse faculty in the last 5 years and more than 5 years in the faculty role. Most of the participants had been in academia 10 years or more. Somebody had 35 years, and then there were a couple who had that 5 or 6 year and that were going up for tenure. So what were our results? So being a grounded theory, we had to demonstrate a process, and this was the process that we found from the data. So this was the complete theoretical framework. There is 4 stages, and then within that, there's 3 strands within each phase. And this was extremely interesting to us because oftentimes when we read mentoring data or talk about mentoring, we oftentimes focus just on this work. Like, what are we doing within the mentoring relationship to get people to the next level? But our data told us that there's really more than the work. It's also the emotional impact of mentoring for our mentors, and then also how they develop a relationship together. Okay. So in phase 1, we titled this Getting Together. And the kind of important part here was the relationship building with the protege. This was typically a formal assignment by an administrator, such as a department chair or a dean. But there were also several informal relationships. And these relationships began because of co-teaching, maybe a previous relationship within the hospital, or similar interests, or maybe just having an office next door to each other. The work of mentoring in phase 1 was overwhelmingly teaching focused. New faculty, when they come in, whether they are PhD, EDD, DNP, graduate prepared, everybody wants to focus and learn how to teach, because that is kind of the first thing that they come up against is being in a classroom full of students. And so it was primarily teaching focused. The mentors focused on meeting the protege's immediate needs. And so oftentimes they sat with them and they said, okay, tell me what you need to focus on today. And sometimes that was, well, my student, has this issue with this test question, help me go through item analysis. Then the third piece of this was the emotional impact. And so very early on, the mentors talked about just kind of this overwhelming uncertainty they had, that they weren't quite sure what they were supposed to be doing. You know, it was a new relationship, and they kind of lacked some guidance and resources for mentoring. And because of that, that uncertainty came on, well, okay, if I don't know what I'm doing, then I'm just going to start mentoring based on what I think that they need to know. So one quote that a participant mentioned on the emotional impact, they said, "This is our new mentoring program. Our administrators did a spreadsheet and told us this is the protege, this is the mentor, and then that was it. Looking back, it's almost funny that that is all the direction we were given in the mentoring program." So in phase 2, getting going, the relationship with the protege started to develop a deeper connection, and the mentor talked a lot about recognizing the protege's potential in academia. The work of mentoring shifted from teaching to more of that teaching, scholarship, and service, and how you could be successful in all three. And then this is where the conversation started to talk about, okay, this is what your annual review looks like. This is what a dossier looks like for promotion and tenure. And then the emotional impact, the mentor started to feel appreciated for the work that they did, but kind of as the relationship was getting going, then it took more time. And they became very overwhelmed due to workloads, lack of support, and shortages. And this was a very interesting fact too, is that there was also a heavy emotional toll related to proteges who struggled. So whether they struggled with student relationships or they felt like they just didn't fit in, the mentor almost kind of took it upon themselves to feel those struggles too. So one participant had to say about the relationship with her protege, she said she loved her job and responsive. She was active, responsible, and independent, and she was a rule follower. She had a lot to learn, but she wanted to get better, and she always wanted to know, how should I have approached this? So in phase 3, going together, the relationship with the protege started to build this mutual trust and commitment to the relationship, and it shifted from this hierarchical to more of a collaborative relationship. The work of mentoring focused on academic culture and relationships. And then the last piece of that emotional impact was satisfaction and joy from mentoring. And many of our mentors actually use the word that I feel I'm paying it forward to the next generation. And they had some confidence in their mentoring abilities. Regarding the work, this was interesting. A participant said, "It's acculturation. I have to explain to my mentee why we do things this way. It's how to manage your advising workload, how to manage personalities in academia, how to negotiate the politics, you know, things that are not on the checklist." And then the last phase is going beyond. The relationship with the protege, one participant said, leaving the mentoring nest, right? She had this little bird that went off and was very successful. But I think that's a good way to explain it, right? And then the mentors celebrated the protege's independence and growth, and they developed interpersonal relationships and friendships. The work of mentoring really was more about, okay, my mentee or my protege, you know, really needs to work more on service. So I'm connecting them with somebody else who I think can help them with leadership development. And so it was just connecting with resources and then professional championing for success. And then the emotional impact, the mentors felt a sense of loss. And one participant had to say, "I don't ever say, okay, I'm done being your mentor. That's not comfortable for me. So the only time the relationship ever ends is if they leave. But other than that, I consider myself accessible." So discussion and implications. The main piece here is that our mentors face a lot of challenges. They have heavy workloads, limited time, and then there's an unclear matching process and lack of connection. And then there's little guidance and resources for the relationship. Because of that, the quality between relationships can vary greatly. However, mentors receive benefits from mentoring, changes over time, and of course, collegiality and friendship. So implications: do good matching of your dyads, provide resources, and then help to mitigate workplace stressors. We were able to get one publication from the study that I just explained. We have another one under review from that extra data that we were able to collect. And then this same presentation was presented in December in Orlando. Thank you for the CRCW funding, my co-author and research mentor, Claire Drucker, and then we were able to bring on a student research assistant here at UCCS, and that was an amazing opportunity as well. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Next up is, I was like, which one is today? Okay, no problem. Christine can't be with us, but we've got Emily Mooney here, so we'll get that set up and here is your.
All right, good morning. I'm happy to talk about the research that Christine and I did. Christine can't be here this morning, so I'll be talking for both of us. So the title is Tracking Change in the Mountains, Alpine Insects and Tree-Line Ecosystems as Indicators of Climatic Shifts. So before diving into our research and results, I just want to acknowledge all of the students that have been involved in this project. This is really one of our goals with seeking funding, is finding ways to pay students and get students involved in research. So all of these names that you see here had the chance to participate either out in the field or in the lab as well, which is really great, including one of Christine's classes as well, and some colleagues at Regis University and a really great NGO called Mountain Area Land Trust, or MALT as they're also known. Cool, so we have a really interesting habitat here in Colorado. So I'm gonna take you guys up to the mountains a little bit. Think about one of the really unique ecosystems we have, which is the alpine tundra. So these habitats occur above tree line, normally above around 11,000 feet. And they have kind of a typical low growing plant structures that you see over here. And then on this map from the Colorado Native Plant Society, all that area in white is this alpine tundra. So it's pretty cool. These areas, however, are warming a lot faster than other areas of the globe. This graph here comes from over 4,000 sensors and probably about, I don't know, 100 different sites all over the world. And the kind of reddish color there are some of the high alpine environments, and they tend to be warming a lot faster than other parts of the globe. So these alpine environments are warming at a faster rate. One of the key biotic responses, and really the focus of Christine's work on this project, is that we're seeing an upward shift of tree lines. So trees actually moving into this tundra zone. And it can be a little bit complex. It's not necessarily just trees marching upwards. There could be community shifts as well as conditions get warmer in these alpine environments. The overall goal of this project, in addition to involving students, was to really answer this question: how are insect abundance and tree line structure changing in response to these global changes that we're seeing? There we go. The particular location for our site is a site called Pennsylvania Mountain. So if you've ever driven from here, let's say out to Breckenridge, past the turnoff to Penn Mountain, it's not technically a 14-year, but it's up there. And this picture here shows the alpine tundra. Interestingly enough, UCCS actually owns 9 acres of alpine tundra at this site, which is pretty wild. You can think about all the random stuff that we might own. We own a chunk of alpine tundra. And that reflects really the long history of research by UCCS people at this site, going back all the way to the 1970s. So it's a great place to work. It looks a little bit barren though, right? Doesn't look really exciting. That's really typical of the alpine tundra. All the plants are very low growing, kind of hanging out below the surface. So if you look a little bit closer, there's a ton of really cool flowering plants. And these guys are full of nectar. And that nectar is a really important resource for a lot of insects, which is what I study. Speaking of the long tradition of UCCS researchers at this site, that nectar was the source of a publication that was published back in the 1990s from research that was done in the 1970s and 80s by a researcher called Peter Kevin. He went on to the University of Guelph in Canada, but he was one of the original professors here at UCCS. Way back when, he got an NSF grant from a program called Man in Biosphere to basically go out to the alpine tundra at Penn Mountain and trap some moths. And I just love the title of the paper that they produced. So liquid assets for fat bankers. It's so good. I don't, I can't live up to this. Is what it comes down to. It's just too good. And the fat bankers he was talking about, the liquid assets being the nectar, but the fat banker that he's talking about is an insect that we in Colorado Springs are probably familiar with, especially this time of year, the miller moth. Love them or hate them, they are a part of our biodiversity in this region. And, every time of year, around this time of year, we see news articles, miller moth infestation for all the new arrivals from California and Texas. They're scary. And then there's so many of them that you can actually pick them up on radar. This is from 2 years ago. This is the miller moths in flight. So there's a lot of them. So these guys have a really interesting life cycle. They come to Colorado, like a lot of other migrants from the Plains states. During summertime, they kind of come through Colorado Springs, and then they spend their summers in the mountains drinking nectar and gaining lipids or gaining fats. But the rest of the year, they are also a agricultural pest as well. So another name for these guys is the army cutworm moth, because they're also a pest. And so back in the 70s, this is kind of a fun story. I had to track down, this was like during COVID, 2021, everything was shut down. I had to track down the original thesis from Peter Kevin's students, basically in the basement of the library at CU Boulder. And I got it, including, you can kind of see over here, even with some like food stains on it. But I was able to relocate the original sampling locations from photos from this thesis. And so for 3 years, my students and I went out to these original sampling sites that we relocated and sort of retracked the moths, and sort of resampled the same study that Peter Kevin and his students had done way back when. So way back when, 1978, 1979, 1980, pretty consistent pattern. Moths are up in the high elevation and they're gaining fat over time. They're drinking nectar, putting on fat, because as you all know, you can turn carbs into fat, unfortunately. So that was the pattern back in the 1970s. And again, for the last 3 years, my students and I have repeated that. And we've really kind of found a mixed bag. 2021 and 2022, we see instead of gaining lipids over time, these moths are actually losing weight over time. 2023 is a little bit of a ray of hope. We actually see that same pattern that we saw in the 1970s. But overall, things have gotten less consistent. So coming up to the alpine zone is not necessarily a good place to forage for these miller moths anymore, not in every year. Of course, when we repeated our sampling, the original study design had 4 traps along what we as ecologists call an elevation gradient in the mountains. And elevation gradients are a really common method to kind of act as a time machine almost, where we have basically sites at lower elevations reflecting greater degrees of environmental change, warmer, drier, things have been warmer and drier for longer, versus high elevation, where might be conditions that are more similar to the past. And when we look at this change in lipid patterns against this elevation gradient, we see some interesting results. And in particular, if we look at what's happening at low elevations, in those years where these miller moths were losing weight over the summer, it was really driven by changes happening at these lower elevation sites. So things were kind of particularly bad for them, where there had been more environmental change. And some of the environmental changes that have happened kind of feed over into really Christine's part of the project. And some of the changes that have been studied at this mountain by past researchers. So these data come from a study done by Candace Galen. She was at the University of Missouri, and she had basically worked for Peter Kevin back in the day and kept a lot of his work going, really focusing on bumblebees. And the study, what they found basically is that at these lower elevations, kind of shown in red over there, we see since the 1970s about a 60% loss of floral resources. So she was really focusing on bumblebees, but you can imagine the same things happening for miller moths as well. We're just losing those liquid assets. So pretty dramatic. And where are they going? Where are those flowers going? And again, this is what Christine's work really focused on, is that we see moving into this lower elevation zone are these dense thickets of willows. So willows are totally native to the alpine zone, but just with changing conditions, they're doing better, they're thriving. So we're really replacing what was once a really multi-species carpet of wildflowers with essentially a monoculture of just willows. And part of Christine's work, which I'm not going to get too much into, really looked at how these willows are actually slowing down the movement of tree line change. So they're really kind of impacting how tree line is responding to warmer conditions as well. So these willows are kind of driving sort of the two responses that both Christine and I looked at. So why does this matter? You know, love them or hate them, we've got Miller moss as a part of, you know, our lives here this time of year. But it's part of a larger picture that's happening, which is often called the insect apocalypse, where not just Miller moths, but around the world, all different types of insects native to different ecosystems are declining. And this paper came out by David Wagner at the University of Connecticut, really had a great title, which is Death by 1,000 Cuts. So really in this study, I'm seeing the impacts of, you know, tree line shifts, but we can think about all of these other factors coming together for a lot of insects driving populations in decline. And when we lose these insects, we lose all of the services that they provide as well. So whether it is a predator that regulates a disease vector or pollinator of our crops, we're losing all these benefits that we get from insect biodiversity. All right, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, thanks so much. Our next presenter in session 2 will be Dylan Harris. Come on up.
Oh, it's not working. There. Perfect. Okay. All right. So thank you all for coming. I'm Dylan. I work in the geography department, assistant professor. I've been here almost 4 years. And this project, the CRCW funding, helped over the past 2 years. And I'm happy to report on various things that have come from it, various other projects, things like that. But let me just give you the details, and I'll do my best to keep it to 10 minutes. So basically, maybe you do, maybe you don't know. A lot of what we understand about climate change comes from climate archives, things like ice cores, pollen grains found in lake sediment. And these things tell us a lot about atmospheric geochemistry thousands, millions of years ago, right? It helps us understand these different scales of climate change, like tectonic change over millions of years. Even millennial change, right? We can see how things happen at that scale from something like a pollen grain. The problem with this is that it's invaluable, right? We need that, but it's really expensive to obtain that. It's also really inaccessible in terms of how to study it, right? You need to have extreme expertise to access these things. This is actually the ice core laboratory up near Boulder. But each of these came from a project that cost millions of dollars, right? And they go sit in this laboratory and have folks study them, but you have to be so specialized to understand that, right? So again, I come from a place of geography, come from a place of sort of community engaged research, and I study climate change. And I also come from rural Mississippi, that's where I grew up. So a lot of my research is about how to talk to my parents about climate change. And this isn't it, right? That's not gonna help. So basically, and to add to this as well, a lot of climate science has historically been by white men and scientists, and that is also a problem, right? There are other forms of understanding climate change, for example. So this also stems from my work in climate change communication. So again, trying to find ways to communicate climate change to folks who may not want to talk about it or may not know how to talk about it, right? So there's various sort of approaches to this, right? There's kind of the historical information deficit model that suggests if people just knew more stuff, they'd make better decisions. I don't think that's gonna work, right? We have thousands and thousands and thousands of articles on climate change every day, and people still make decisions, right? So that's not really working, right? People have tried the moral argument that you have to care about the future, right? Weird, that doesn't work either, who cares? And also fear, right? This idea that, you know, if you don't do it, it's gonna be really bad at a certain time in the future, right? And all these things have worked for different populations, but ultimately we're still dealing with this issue And it stems not from, in my experience, a lack of understanding or not that people don't believe, rather that people are weary of climate science in particular, right? Not just science in general. There is a sort of national context in which scientific knowledge is being sort of questioned, and that can also be tied to a lot of these issues. But ultimately, what it comes down to with climate change specifically is people don't trust the experts. People don't trust what they're saying, right? It's interesting if you consider that with the eclipse that just happened. Scientists could predict that, and thousands of people were able to flock to Texas and believe that was going to happen, and it did. But it's not the same for climate change, right? And there's all kinds of questions as to why that's the case, and we can talk about that. But for now, basically, from my experience in sort of engaging with communities in West Virginia, Alaska, Georgia, Tennessee, Mississippi, places that I spend a lot of time, places that are relatively conservative, places that are experiencing climate change in profound ways, but again, don't want to talk about it. Again, I find that it's less that people don't believe and more that they don't trust the experts. They don't trust who's telling them. And if you go back to that last slide, right, experts are in Boulder, right? They're scientists getting millions of dollars from NSF to study ice cores. It's not accessible. Add to this that there are experts out there who are intentionally miscommunicating about climate change. So last October, I was on a panel with this guy who's a representative for our county, who not only doesn't believe in climate change, but introduced legislation to the state of Colorado that would declassify carbon as a problem, right? It's just plant food, no worries. And so we have folks like this who are passionate driving this narrative of misinformation in our state. We have organizations like the CO2 Coalition, which purports itself as a scientific organization. They have a Nobel Peace, or not Peace Prize, but a Nobel scientist, whatever they're called, physicist, who sort of leads that. And it has the sort of facade of professional, right? And so people see things like this report that mirrors the IPCC report that says there's no such thing as climate change. So you have all these competing interests all at the same time. Then you just have normal people like my dad who are like, what am I supposed to think about this, right? So I'm approaching this from the perspective of environmental justice, climate justice, and specifically procedural justice, which is this idea that people need information to make decisions for themselves, right? You can't just tell people what to think. No one likes that. So a lot of my work stems from this. A lot of my work outside of this project stems from this. I'm very interested in energy justice, climate justice, and specifically giving folks tools, ideas, thoughts, knowledge to create their own ideas, right? Again, climate denialism stems more from a distrust in science than of the information itself. I know it's a subtle distinction, but it does matter quite a bit when you think about Appalachia specifically, where I do a lot of work where there's a history of exploitation by scientists. There's a history of folks from the Northeast coming down and saying Appalachian people are dumb, they're stupid because their environment suggests this much. And people know that, right? It's not something that happened 20 years ago they don't think about. The whole war on poverty is based on that. The war on poverty is a daily reality in places like West Virginia. And it hasn't worked. So preliminary work, I spent a lot of time, during my dissertation work in these regions, basically using storytelling as a method to talk about climate change, not to avoid it, not to manipulate folks, but to find meaningful ways to talk about something that's impacting everyone in language and in a process that they can resonate. Right? I'm very careful. I don't want to say that they can understand. I'm very careful. Storytelling is not about patronizing folks, right? It's about helping folks learn up rather than learning down, right? With science, right? Often storytelling is presented as a way to communicate science to dumb people. That's not what I'm doing, right? I think it's actually quite the opposite. So what I found in that work is that specifically context and community is really critical, right? That's probably not a surprise. Speech 101 is know your audience. But it's more than that. It's knowing, again, histories of scientific exploitation in a region. And I don't need to bring that up every time I talk to this 60-year-old white woman who probably doesn't care, but it's background noise, right? So I have to know that as a science communicator, that I'm speaking to a group of people who are in a region that has good reason to be weary of climate science because it's historically resulted in unemployment, right? So I did this work. It was great. I learned a lot. And what I really took away from this, and this particular picture is actually in northern Georgia at a place called Foxfire. It's an oral history archive. They do lots of folklore work. Was that I wanted to kind of drill in on folklore specifically with my ongoing work. One of many projects I have going on, too many projects, but basically taking paleoclimatology, right? That science that I love. It's inspiring. It's so cool that people can study ice cores and understand the atmosphere 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, right? I also am really fascinated with climate modeling, right? That's wild. that we can predict the future. And then we do a lot of work in hoping folks believe it, right? It is about that. It's interesting, philosophical, right? But then there's also this world of critical folklore studies that exist in the humanities that basically suggest that people have always known exactly what they need, how to do it. We just need to pay attention, right? So combining those two through this process of what I call experimental political ecology, which is essentially, political ecology is what my background is in. It's a sort of understanding that the environment is fraught with all kinds of power relations. So taking that and kind of putting communities and scientists in conversation together, specifically around folklore, right? So I will hurry. But basically, this is the gist of my project, right? And it probably doesn't look like much right now, but essentially in northern Georgia, there's all kinds of alternative archives to climate change that people have created. And it's a record of change over time. It's a record of adaptation. So this is a book of recipes of dyeing practices. It's like very scribbly, but basically it says, 2 fronds of this, blah, blah, blah. It makes this color. And this woman has kept this book for over 30 years. She has her grandma's book. So there's almost a 100-year record of these colors, which the same recipe done every couple of years actually changes a bit. And there's something to be said about the mixing, et cetera. But it's ultimately 2 things: that the quality of colors have changed because the actual geochemical composition of the soil producing the plants has changed. But ultimately, things have migrated, right? So they've had to change their colors because the plant died or migrated north. Or in the case of insects, they've actually migrated north so that they don't have to go to Mexico to get cochineal, for example, if you go to Georgia now. So the point of this project is essentially to understand that, again, people know exactly what they're doing. People have been doing it for a long time. My job as a scientist or researcher, whatever you want to consider me, is to essentially take what people know, compare it to historical other kinds of climate data, and to show them that they do understand climate change, right? It's not this political issue, it's your grandma's recipe, right? And there's a visceral change over time that you can refer to. And it's actually been really impactful for folks to, again, produce their own knowledge on this topic, right? So that's what I spent a lot of time doing with this CRCW grant, is essentially building on this folklore archive idea. Just wrapping up here, right? I kind of mentioned this already, but essentially, I have turned this into an NSF career grant that I got really good feedback on, but I'm gonna have to reapply, whatever. That essentially I want to break it down into something very simple: seeing, tasting, hearing, climate change, right? The 5 senses. And one way to see it, I've already kind of talked about it, right? You can see change over time in colors. Essentially, this is an old book that was reprinted recently with all kinds of recipes on natural dyeing that has this kind of calendar of plants. And when you go down to northern Georgia, what bloomed in May 30 years ago is very different than what blooms now. Dog fennel has changed it down here somewhere, right? So there's a visual representation of that. I mentioned cochineal, for example, as well, which is a little beetle that historically has been in Mexico, but now you can get in Georgia. Great. So that's actually kind of a benefit to Sharon and her process. Black walnut's pretty ubiquitous. That's in almost every recipe, but it's actually becoming harder to find. It's migrating north if you look at climate projections. And then white walnut's all but gone, right? And you can essentially acknowledge or know that there's a long history of white walnut and dyeing practices in the South, not because I love this, but because the Confederate soldiers' uniforms, that color was from white walnut, right? All of those were dyed with white walnut, and now you can't find any in the South. And then wrapping up here quickly to, tasting climate change, right? So my grandparents, who do not believe in superstition, but do plant by the signs, or at least used to, which is essentially understanding that where the stars are in space, you can plant things in the ground, right? That's changed, right? It doesn't work anymore. Those calendars haven't worked anymore. This is a much more kind of visceral experience, but up until the 1980s in southern or northern Georgia, people used to smoke meat still, right? They would leave it out during the wintertime. But I have all kinds of quotes from this archive that just suggest we can't do that. The meat will rot. It's not cold enough. So there's all these, again, visceral taste, scent, smell, ways to understand climate change. It's not just about understanding it, but about communicating it back to those communities and helping them create their own archive, essentially is what my project is. So wrapping up, next steps, continue to do work in Colorado. I actually do a lot of work with the Colorado Springs Pioneers Museum. I extended my CRCW to do work in the Gulf Coast area, so kind of getting back to New Orleans, doing some of this work. So working on that, I've published several articles. I feel like I should have put that. There's like 3 or 4 articles we can follow up if you're really interested. A big issue that comes up a lot that I'm working on right now still is thinking through ethical considerations in the archive, and there's not enough time to dig into that right now, but I think about this a lot. Essentially, what do you do with good things by bad people, right? In a context of cancel culture, right? This particular organization has a weird history, it has a valuable archive, but that person who created it's complicated. So that's something I think about a lot. Ongoing work integrating this with sort of traditional climate data, right? Remote sensing. And then finally, like I said, I applied at NSF. I'll try it again. I applied to the Mellon Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation to kind of expand on this work. And I actually just found out when I was sitting here 2 minutes ago that I got this grant, the Lincoln Field Policy. So smaller grant, but that is sort of getting into more of the weeds of carbon management and the future of Appalachia. So, but connected to this work. So thank you. Happy to take questions at some other time. And yeah, thanks.
I'm gonna have you check my email, see if there's any good news in it. All right, last but not least in session 2 is Janelle Owens. Please join us up here.
Right, I don't have as many cool pictures as Emily, and I don't think I'll have as many fun historical facts as Dylan. So it's kind of hard to go last. Those were really engaging and interesting talks. And my one link to climate change now is because it's so warm outside, many people are spending more time indoors, right? So we are in indoor environments. And the project that we had proposed 2 years ago was exploring the residential exposome. So I'm really interested and have been interested in a long time in a field called environmental toxicology. So what kinds of pollutants are we exposed to on a daily basis that influence our health and makeup, right, going forward? And one of the things that I've been really interested in has been collecting dust lately. So I really need to get out more because now my colleagues know me as someone who can go and collect dust from their offices, their homes. And lately we've been accepting furnace filters, right, from HVAC systems. I know, live dangerously. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about what the human exposome was. So when we talk about the human exposome, it could be things that are what we consider to be internal. So this would be your epigenetic makeup. So how are genes turned on or off, for example? So you may have genes that you've inherited from your mother or your father, but why are they expressed when they are expressed? We could have metabolic effects. So what kinds of secondary metabolites are produced in the body as a basic process of living, right? We also look at what we consider to be general external factors. So things that are residential, things that could be based on our socioeconomic factors. So where we live influences our health. We know that, right, from many other studies. And then lastly, we consider things like our diet and our lifestyle choices. And then this one in light blue that I'm really interested in is this idea of environment and occupation. So what are these chemical exposures that we are exposed to? What kinds of things do we even bring into our homes is our internal indoor environment that then influence health outcomes. Okay. So this paper was published in 2004 by, I guess he would be considered my academic grandparent, if that's a thing, right? Okay, so this is a really interesting study, and there's only going to be a few chemical structures here. So breathe deeply, right? So we were really interested for a long time in one of these compounds called brominated diphenyl ethers. So with brominated diphenyl ethers, there's something like 209 compounds within this class. And what that means is the structures are all going to be the same, in which you have these two carbon rings linked together through this oxygen, and then these bromine atoms are going to be sticking off in various positions. Okay? And what they have found, these were some of these chemicals that we now consider to be these legacy pollutants. And they have been found in many, many different matrices, is the term that we would use, excuse me, including human breast milk, tissues of animals, especially
those that live far north in the Arctic, far away from where we would ever use these kinds of compounds, and things like in butter, right? So we find them in our foods as well. And so these then replaced what were considered to be these pollinated or polybrominated biphenyls, and then they're these diphenyl ethers. So in this study that was done in 2004, they looked at time versus concentration, the total concentration of these polybrominated diphenyl ethers. And as they increased over time, they noticed that there was a great correlation, right? This was pretty reasonable for environmental data, but there was also very high loads for folks who lived in North America. So why is that, right? And so they looked at a number of factors that said, well, it may be because of the size of our homes, the types of products that we bring into our homes. So there were many different reasons that they could hypothesize why there were going to be higher levels of these pollutants. And so some of the sources of these flame retardants are many of the things that we bring into the home. So it could be insulation, the things that we use to build our homes, the types of furniture we buy. It could be in the fabrics, in the carpet padding made with recycled foams, certain products for children. And a big problem is the dust that is created inside our homes. So this was one of those first classes of compounds that we started looking at extensively. And this was all over the news in about 2008, right? And what was really interesting about this work as well is that aside from your single largest exposure in your lifetime, which is going to be through breast milk, anything after that stage of life, when we are exposed to these types of compounds, our estimated daily intake for all other stages of life are going to be in this dark blue, which is soil and dust, right? So we're going to make sure that we're going to be tidy in the home, right? So this study may even make you think about using gloves even when you empty out your vacuum cleaner at home because of the levels of dust or compound concentrations that we're finding within dust inside the home. So some of the reasons that we were particularly interested in this, and we've so far published 2 papers out of this project, where we wanted to see if we could develop a protocol using quote unquote a green approach. Can we develop a protocol that uses a minimal amount of solvent in order to take these compounds that are going to be partitioning into dust and then stick them on the front end of our really expensive instruments, right? Because as soon as you put dust anywhere in there, you're going to risk contaminating that work. You need to make sure it's clean. So we had this great time of taking all of these furnace filters that were donated. I still have tons in my research lab. If anybody's interested in accepting some of your own, I can hand them out again. We would cut off a small section here, and then we would sieve the dust and then catch it, and then we would use that for analysis going forward. And so this is how we ended up developing that green protocol, is that we would take a small fraction of that dust and we would move it through our process of adding solvent to it, mixing that up well before we had a very clean layer that we could then inject onto our instruments. So the 2 instruments here, we used a gas chromatograph mass spectrometry, or GCMS. If you've watched CSI before, you know, the beautiful woman with the long black hair and the cool lab safety goggles will say, put it on the GCMS. I got a hit 10 seconds later. Doesn't work like that, right? But so that's one of the instruments that we utilize frequently in my research lab. And then we also have a liquid chromatography tandem mass spec instrument, which is LCMS-MS for short. So between those 2 instruments, we have essentially a home mortgage that we can then pay. They're very expensive for what they do. But we're able to then generate these, what we call calibration curves. So we use authentic standards for the chemicals that we're interested in profiling, and we inject those authentic standards onto the instruments with known concentrations, and then we look at the instrument response. And that's going to give us a linear relationship. And so then when we analyze our unknown samples or any of those dust samples that have come from volunteers who have donated that material, we're then able to determine the concentration there. So we did that for a number of compounds. And so what did we find? So I'm going to wrap up here with just a few slides of the information of what we've discovered. So these are called box and whisker plots. And so we are going to have the dust samples that we surveyed. So we had 47 total versus the studies that we've looked at in the literature. And in the literature studies, all these dust samples that they've collected have all been done by vacuuming. So it was a small space within the home versus this entire filter that is then used to assess the circulating air volumes within the home. And what you'll notice here is this maroonish color, which is our data. We found much higher levels in furnace filters than vacuuming, right? So this probably happens because anytime you step or move in the home, you cause dust to be recirculated. Whereas vacuuming is only going to assess a small zone, right? So now we're looking at the whole house load. So we were really excited by these types of data, which is odd, right? But we did say, wow, this is really interesting. What kinds of things are we breathing in routinely? So this was for all different kinds of what we would consider new replacement flame retardants, because we've gotten away from this polybrominated diphenyl ethers. So the next question we asked is, can this load be tied to home location? So we looked at rural versus urban areas. And interestingly, we found in some cases a statistically significant association with a rural area. And we thought, well, this is kind of odd. Why is that? And it turns out it's probably linked to the age of the home. These are newer homes with newer types of polymers inside the home. And so they're being replaced by newer flame retardants that are being utilized in consumer products today. So that's, we think, is what happened in there. That's more to unpack, certainly. And then can we tie this to any kind of home characteristics? So we sent out a survey to our participants who sent in their furnace filters for survey. And so we asked them, how much of your home is carpeted versus hardwood versus laminate? And while we saw some trends towards significance, it didn't really indicate that there was anything about the flooring type of the home that would then dictate what kinds of concentrations we were finding, though it does certainly seem to say that things that have plastic or a lot of plastic content, like laminate, is certainly going to be important. We've also found that if you have newer carpet in an older home, you're going to have much higher levels of these types of compounds as well. So we've started asking participants, when did you get new carpet, right? And what kind of carpet? So future goals, we're looking now to selectively quantitate indoor chemicals, and we're looking at a whole slew of new things. So personal care products, antibacterial consumer products within dust, potential endocrine disrupting compounds, so things that mimic hormones within the body that then can alter how we express things. We're also doing a non-target screen. So can we find additional chemicals that we don't have standards for yet, but we're asking what else can we find within these samples? And then lastly, we're asking the question of what are we wearing, right? That's what my daughter asks me every day. What are you wearing? But now we're actually looking at the pollutant load that you wear next to your skin. And the way that we're doing this is we're collecting laundry lint. And we're using that as a passive sampling tool to actually look for chemical exposure that rests next to our skin. So that's another project that's ongoing. And lastly, we have gotten some external funding so far. This is an Air Force Educational Partnership Agreement grant, and they transferred this humdinger a la carte model GCMS to us. So purchase price for one of these instruments is about $150K. So it's great that we were able to get that from the lab, and we're now using it. So thank you very much. There's a lot of people to thank here, and especially CRCW and NSF for the LCMS. So thank you.
All right, well, that concludes our session 2. We're going to take just a few minute break before we start our session 3. Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the CRCW presentations. I'm your Vice Provost, Jessie Smith. I use she, her pronouns, and I do want to acknowledge that this land on which we sit at together today is stolen land from our Indigenous peoples. People always want to learn about the fabulous work of our researchers and our artists and our performers at UCCS, and this is a particularly great forum to do that. It is funded by the CRCW. That stands for the Committee on Creative Research and Creative Works. The SEED grant program has been operating since 2010. We've given out 170 plus SEED grants at the tune of $1 million. And the goal is to fund as many people as possible, all different colleges, departments, ways of knowing, faculty at different ranks, doing all different kinds of research, which you'll get a flavor of in today's presentations. The way that the funding mechanism works is the CRCWs are supported by what we call F&A, which comes from grant funding. And so you'll see part of the goal is to give faculty researchers a little bit of startup so they can get a proof of concept, maybe collect some pilot data, maybe test out some new materials or techniques so that they can be positioned to be competitive for some future funding. That's important because that future funding then pays for the next round of CRCW winners. So you can see it's quite a nice cycle. Research, of course, is such an important and central part of our mission as academics and here at UCCS. And I want to get right to our presentations. And first up today is Shannon Johnson.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Shannon Johnson. I'm an assistant professor with the social work department at the College of Public Service and the MSW director as well. And what I'm presenting on today is part of the mixed method study that I conducted in partnership with Dr. Stephanie Gangemi and an MSW student of ours as well, Ren. It was 2 parts. It was a survey study along with a cognitive interviewing study, and I'm going to share about the cognitive interviewing portion. I'll start off by talking a little bit about moral injury. The entire study focused on moral injury specifically among law enforcement officers, and so I'll talk about that piece moving forward as well. But as for what moral injury is, to set the stage, you can basically understand it. It's been referred to as a soul wound, and you can understand it essentially as what happens to someone when they have either done something or been part of something that has offended their morals or belief system. Sometimes it might not even just be an act or a commission, but it might be organizational culture that leads into that as well. A lot of the interviews that I'll share kind of focused on sense of betrayal as a form of moral injury. But essentially it's a crisis of meaning. And that crisis of meaning is basically existential in nature for a lot of folks and upsets the very fundamentals of their belief systems. And there are a lot of consequences that come out of that. It is an increasingly emphasized topic throughout first responder professions and among law enforcement officers. It's been looked at more and more recently and is recognized as a key piece of what's going on. There's a more and more emphasis on officer well-being because we see suicidality, behavioral health issues, so on and so forth. And this is a population that does not necessarily seek help. Mental health is not something that is emphasized in the profession. And so we have folks who are kind of in a bad position when it comes to needing assistance that they don't get. Oh, actually, in terms of the examples of things that lead into moral injury, at the very bottom of the slide here, it's different across professions. Within the context of law enforcement, it tends to be use of force situations if someone is harmed in some way. Difficult judgment calls often made in the fraction of a second, right, that lead to negative consequences, following unethical orders and then feeling bad about it later, organizational betrayal, as I had mentioned. And one other piece of moral injury is that it generally stems from high stakes situations, and in law enforcement, that basically means that people literally will have 2 seconds to make a decision and then sorry. There we go. People will have 2 seconds to make a decision and then live with the consequences. Why does it matter? Because it leads to symptoms of shame, existential crisis, sense of betrayal. It's been associated with depression and anxiety, anger, self-harm, social challenges as well. And so pretty sweeping effects, and spiritual crisis is a big piece of it as well for folks who have a spiritual orientation. In terms of why we chose to pursue this research, as I had mentioned, there's an increasing emphasis on officer wellness. There's a need to better understand what's happening for officers that leads to the problems that we're seeing. There's a lot of division in society between the community and law enforcement that just exacerbates things. There's a need for compassion. There's a need for looking at what's really going on with folks and figuring out how to better address it. And so this research clarifies what moral injury looks like in the law enforcement context and sets us up to be able to do additional work that will lead to better services, better interventions for individual officers and then for law enforcement in general as well at the organizational level. The theoretical framework that kind of informs this work is the meaning-making model, which comes from existential theory. I've mentioned existential crisis a few times, but that whole model basically emphasizes the fact that we are naturally inclined as human beings to need coherence. And so if we have traumatic experiences that don't integrate into the way that we understand ourselves or the world, that don't kind of mesh with our current belief system, it creates a lot of discomfort, and that discomfort manifests as mental health problems and has been associated with negative outcomes. And so with moral injury, what you will see is people engaged in that need-making process. They can't resolve whatever it is that's weighing on their mind, and that leads into the consequences that we see. It's a cognitive interviewing study. Cognitive interviewing is a method that comes out of psychology. It's basically a think aloud approach where the person that you're talking to kind of responds off the cuff without censoring themselves to whatever question you're asking. And then in addition to that, it's often focused specifically on a measure. And so we had folks go through, one part of it was just kind of talking through the concept of moral injury, but another part was talking through the items on the moral injury event scale specifically. And the goal there was essentially to assess the degree to which moral injury, as currently understood, because that scale was developed with veterans. So to see how much moral injury as currently understood maps onto the policing profession or not, right? And so folks basically talked about their experiences of moral injury and then critiqued that scale specifically. I'm not sure what my issue is here. Okay. Well, I'll just take it from here. I think I might have lost something, but that's fine. So yeah, cognitive interviewing kind of looks at people's understandings of a construct and the degree to which a measure matches their experiences or not. And then in terms of analysis, we broke it down into 3 different pieces. So we had thematic analysis, focused largely upon how people were talking about moral injury and their own experiences. And then we had the part that was focused more on the cognitive processes, and then their critiques of questions. Our key findings basically demonstrated that moral injury is indeed a major issue in law enforcement. And then from there, conceptualizations do match law enforcement quite well. However, there are a lot of nuances that are specific to law enforcement that are not captured by the moral injury event scale or are not currently reflected in how people are talking about moral injury. And so organizational betrayal is one big example of that. That came up a lot. Yes, people had regrets about decisions that they had made. Yes, there were issues related to following unethical orders, so on and so forth. But the organizational betrayal, the way that people were treated by others in the profession was a huge piece also. Yeah, and so in terms of the feedback that came on the scale itself, it was incorporating the role of organizational culture, addressing leadership styles, addressing institutional betrayal. The core themes broke down into causes of moral injury, impacts of moral injury, and then basically future directions. And so in terms of causes, a lot of the things that I had already talked about, and I know I'm going fast, but I don't want to use more of my time than I'm allowed. Impacts of moral injury, folks talked about negative mental health impacts, intrusive thoughts, basically for years and years, kind of playing the same scenarios over in their heads and wondering, what if I had done this instead, sort of scenarios. Decreased job satisfaction, and moral disengagement is a big piece as well. People might go into the profession in one place morally, and then over time find that that sort of erodes and they're in a different place. What's needed? Psychoeducation, more attention to mental health, more openness to addressing mental health, better understanding of moral injury, culture change, changes in leadership, and then moral courage is a big piece that we've been talking about as well. These are some quotes that illustrate the themes. And I will just read one or two, and then we'll go from there. So for betrayal as a theme, in terms of causes of moral injury, I felt completely let down by the people I trusted the most. It's like they turned their backs when I needed them the most, and that hurt more than the injury itself. And that comes from a person who was hurt on the job and basically was ostracized in the aftermath of that rather than given compassion or understanding. Intrusive thoughts. I know that I've directly been part of locking up people who, looking back, probably just didn't really deserve to be locked up, you know? It's just the cumulative effect, a kind of an uneasy feeling where you don't have nearly as much pride in what you used to do. And so you can kind of see that erosion and change over time happening there. As I had mentioned earlier, findings can be used to inform future directions, policy, training, ethical leadership, providing support and interventions, and future directions include those things, and then also just future research. We've talked a lot about doing community-based research that focuses on developing a toolkit of sorts that can be used by law enforcement agencies to better support officers, using psychoeducation tools to advance understanding in law enforcement agencies specifically, just to kind of move things in the right direction and build more momentum around this. So, thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Our next presenter will be Justin Cole.
Hi, my name is Justin Cole. I'm an assistant professor over in the math department. I think I was in the 2021 class of CRCW recipients, and I'm going to talk to you about some of the results that came out of that project. Approximation of topological insulators and Gladys, that even me. So maybe start with some definitions here. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a conductor is a device or an arrangement that allows for the conductivity of electricity. So something like copper wires are a good conductor. An insulator is not a conductor. It's something that prevents the passage of energy or electricity in a medium. Wood is a pretty good insulator. I'm going to talk to you today about topological insulators. It shares qualities of both of conductors and insulators. So the mathematical fundamentals of what I'm talking about today, it can go back to something called Stokes' theorem. And while this looks pretty formidable here, actually we teach this to our calculus students here at UCCS. They take a class called Calc 3, multivariable calculus, and they're expected to understand how to use this formula. So this is an integral. It represents an accumulation or a sum of quantities. On the right is what we call a double integral. So this is a planar region right here, this big square right here. And we're going to be setting up something called the curl. It can be interpreted as vorticity or the twisting nature of a fluid. Think of water, let's say, or like an eddy, or something like this. And so each one inside one of these small squares here, you see a little counterclockwise oriented vortex in there. Now, I've broken these into these little cells here, and in each one of the adjacent walls here, as you can see right here, there is a net cancellation. So the one on the right effectively cancels out with the one on the left. So anytime there's an interior wall, there's no accumulation of these forces here until you get to the boundary. And then on the boundary, there is an uncompensated wall there, and you get an accumulation of flow. This is called circulation, right? It's just how fluid flows. So that's what Stokes' theorem says. The right integral is called double integral. It's an integral over an area. And then the integral on the left is the accumulation of this flow or circulation along the boundary. So this is basically a topological insulator. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is how you can realize these sort of things in a photonic optical type metamaterial. So this was the motivation for the project, which I discussed: topological insulators and Maxwell's equations. Maxwell's equations are the master equations that describe electromagnetic radiation. You see lights in this room. That light, how it transmits in a free space, is described by Maxwell's equations. They are the governing equations here. Now, I'm interested in studying how lights, electromagnetic radiation, and that's everything. That's visible light that we see, that's microwaves, that's infrared waves. That's all described in this equation. I was interested in how microwaves propagate in a metamaterial. Metamaterial is a man-made material, artificial material, that can manipulate and make light do strange things maybe it wouldn't otherwise have done. So here's a very simple configuration that we considered. You have this square array of rods of a special type of material called a ferrite. It's called yttrium on it, but it's some material that you can buy. And they made an array of them here. This is a 4 centimeter scale here. It's a square lattice on the left. It's a honeycomb lattice on the right. And these are actual pictures from experiments that were done 2009, 2011. And so then what we do then is, in this special lattice configuration, we apply an external magnetic field, which creates the system, the conditions for a topological insulator. And then we put an electromagnetic field, we put a signal, we put an antenna, and we try to move electromagnetic radiation through these lattices here. And so what ends up happening, I'll show you in the next slide what's happening here. Let me show you the results actually, and then we'll see what how this manifests itself and what's interesting about this. So what the project was about was, I told you about Maxwell's equations. They are the master equations. Difficult to solve. You can do them numerically, you can solve them, but to do analytical analysis, to get formulas that you can understand what's going on, it's challenging. What we did was we developed what we call a tight binding model. It is a reduced order model. It's a simplified model that describes the system that I just showed you. Here are some results here. I appreciate that these curves will mean a lot to you. Basically, these curves represent different solutions of the system. The black curves are the numerics. That's the target. That's what we want to approximate. And the red dash is how our model did. And I think what I want you to take away is that they agree reasonably well, qualitatively well. And we could do better if we wanted to work a little harder. We're a little lazy. And on the left is a case where there's no magnetic field. There's a touching point that we call a Dirac point. And then when you apply the magnetic field, you open again. Very typical here. And we're doing a pretty good job. Good on the bottom one, reasonable on the top one. And what's significant about this is, to our knowledge, this is the first tight binding model, this first reduced order model for this particular system. So we hope that this encourages more research and study of these types of systems and more insights. Now, topological. What's topology all about? So topology is in this case, these systems are characterized by something called topological invariance. Topological invariant, everybody in this room knows, is the number of holes something has. So a coffee mug has one hole, as does a donut, and those things are topologically equivalent in the sense that I could take, in principle, a coffee mug and think about deforming it into a donut. But I could never deform a coffee mug into this microwave, a spoon or something here, something that doesn't have a hole, because they are topologically distinct. You would have to rip it or something like that. These systems are characterized by special topological numbers called Chern numbers, and our model reproduces. So that made us happy. What's so great about topological invariance? I'll show you in a moment here. So a few quick comments. These are topological insulators. So basically, a topological insulator conducts along the boundary of some medium, and it does not conduct in the middle or the bulk. We get so-called chiral edge modes. Chirality is a handedness. DNA, for instance, has a handedness. In this case, since it's planar, it's either clockwise or counterclockwise. And what's special from an applications point of view about these systems is they're incredibly robust, stable to defects or imperfections in the system. And that's important because anytime I go to my lab and I fabricate one of these systems, despite my best efforts, there's going to be defects or imperfections. These don't care about that. They say that they should still be stable and robust. Had some movies. This is a summary of those movies. So, the figure, there's two columns here. I have excited on this case an edge mode. This is a conductor along the boundary. This cyan field region right here is my boundary. It has to stay above it. And then I send it in, and I put a little notch defect. That's my defect, my imperfection there. With most wave systems, like we're in a room here, and you see all these insulators here, you expect reflection. That's what waves typically do when they see a hard surface, like an acoustic wave, it bounces back at you, okay? These don't do that. That's what's special about them. They go into the notch defects, and it's a little challenging to see, but they exit with the same intensity with which they entered it. So rather than scattering, reflecting, they go right around. Very unusual behavior for these systems, and that really is what people are excited about. In principle, you have a perfect transmitter that propagates in a one-directional fashion here. And even if I put this defect in there, it just goes right around it here. So this has people excited for things, basically mimicking the things you see in electronics that use these similar types of behaviors, diodes, circulators, logic gate switches. We're thinking about using these to transmit energy over long distances. Zeros and ones could be encoded in these type of systems here. And again, it's the robustness that's so special about those. Now that's one topology. What about a different topology? So this on the figure on the column on the right is a different type of topology. It doesn't have the same properties as the one on the left. Just by looking at these two figures here, you could tell them apart. It's a little under the surface, this topology. It's not like a hole or something. That's pretty obvious. But I sent it into the exact same defect right here, and goodness, it's a little difficult to see what's different about it here. There's been a massive amount of reflection. So there's a lot of my energy that I put in got reflected, and it's out here in the middle now. Figures are backwards. Sorry. It's actually the one on the left. This one actually, it went up. This one, it's brighter down here. That's what you should take away. And this one went through, but it lost 2/3 of the damage. So everything I just said to like this, I was backwards here. And if I made this defect larger, I would lose even more energy. So these are not good transmitters here. If I want perfect transmission of whatever I put in and I get out conservation of that energy, I don't think I would want to use this one. I think I like this one much better. And people in engineering, optical engineering communities are working on this right now. Everything right now is there. So that up here already. A quick student project. This has been used to support a student project. Data-driven approximation of these systems. The idea here is perhaps you have numerical or experimental data. Can you construct one of these reduced order models and build them like that? We have some nice results here. We're writing them up right now. I'm working with a student here, Michael, was an undergraduate here, recruited from the math department. He's graduating here in a couple of days with master's, and I think we're going to get him to stick around for a PhD. It's a good way to get good students here. We have good undergrads here, so if you convince them to stick around for a PhD, it's been good in my experience. And we have a convenient algorithm that does this. The only thing I want you to take from these two figures is I want to approximate the solid curves. The dashed curves are approximation. Here I'm doing okay. Squint your eyes, it kind of looks okay. But as I go from the left to the right, I'm doing much better here. You probably might be hard to distinguish it. They're closer. There's still some defects there. We can do even better. We can get to arbitrary precision, as accurate as you want it to be. Lastly, funding. The funding source that I had identified with this particular project was the Young Investigator Program from the Air Force Office of Scientific Research. This is an early career grant. You can only be, I believe, 7 years from your dissertation. They are 3-year grants up to $450,000. I thought this was an appropriate place to send this project because they have a program in electromagnetism at the AFOSR. I applied in summer 2021, got the award later that fall, and started in fall February 2022. So we're about halfway through the project now. What's great about it is it's funding Michael and another student here, completely funding them, gives them a salary and pays their tuition. So that's pretty cool. And me. Thank you, Office of Research, Jesse and Lindsay. Thank you for the reviewers, the announced reviewers, I don't know who you are. And just one quick observation from my point of view is the last couple of years, I think certainly on the STEM side, this has been a very successful project. I mean, we've got a couple of these early career grants, each are about $500,000 for just $7,500 investment. So it's pretty successful. Thanks, everybody.
I was wondering if you were on the wrong side of that graph.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. All right, next up, we have one of our joint projects with Jessica Barrett and Kate Quintana. So I'll, here's the clicker and we'll let you guys take it away.
Thank you so much. So I'm Jessica Barrett. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Public Administration and the College of Public Service. And I'm here today with Kate Quintana, who is in the Criminal Justice Department. So the title of our project is Exploring the Impact of the Legalization of Marijuana on Nonprofits in Colorado. So to get started, I wanted to share the story of how this project got initiated. When I moved to Colorado about 4 years ago, I had a few nonprofit leaders approach me and they asked me what I thought about nonprofits accepting donations from cannabis companies. And this was something I had never thought about. And so I was really intrigued by this question. So I started doing some research. I was looking online and looking at academic journal articles. And online, I started finding these media articles from across the country. Some of the headlines are highlighted up here. And what these articles were saying is that cannabis companies are thriving and they want to give back to their communities in which they're operating in, but nonprofits are reluctant in accepting those donations. So this was really interesting to me, especially given the legal context that we're operating in, and especially here in Colorado, where cannabis is legal on a state level, but yet it is still illegal at a federal level. Furthermore, as I was diving in into this topic, I knew that the cannabis industry was pretty successful here in Colorado, but when I really looked at the figures, I was blown away. So since 2014, when recreational cannabis became legalized in the state, since then, the cannabis industry has generated over $15 billion in Colorado, in revenue alone in Colorado. That just blew me away. So like I said, I knew it was a big industry and a successful one, but not that big. So I saw that potential there. Furthermore, I dove into the academic literature. I was like, all right, what's the literature say about this? Amazingly, there was nothing. I found a lot on other controversial industries such as like alcohol, gambling, tobacco, and related to philanthropy and giving back, but nothing related to cannabis philanthropy. So I saw this as a research gap and a real opportunity to dive into. So as a nonprofit management expert, I knew nothing about the world of cannabis from the cannabis perspective. So I reached out to Kate, who is a drug policy expert, and asked her if she was interested in partnering on this project. So between Kate and applying for getting the CRCW funding, this is where this interdisciplinary project started. So when we first got going, our kind of big overarching research question was, how does the legalization of marijuana impact nonprofits in Colorado? We then, for the purposes of this award, we broke this down into 3 very specific questions. We wanted to know, what is the potential impact that marijuana philanthropy could have on nonprofits across the state? So, we also want to know, with marijuana legalized in Colorado, do nonprofits still see it as tainted money? And lastly, what is the ethical decision-making process of nonprofits accepting or not accepting donations from marijuana dispensaries? So the goals for the CRCW project that we set out for ourselves, we wanted to survey nonprofits and dispensaries across the state of Colorado. we wanted to hire a research assistant. We wanted to write at least 3 journal articles, so we got really ambitious with our survey, collected a lot of data. We wanted to present our preliminary findings at 2 conferences, and in addition to disseminating what we were finding to the academic community, we wanted to make sure that we were also getting these results back out into the community. And then lastly, we knew we wanted to apply for external funding.
So our project outcomes, we surveyed 317 nonprofits and 31 dispensaries. And if you're wondering, was 31 our aim? It absolutely was not. I think we called and emailed every single dispensary in the state of Colorado, which is no easy feat. I had some of the best discussions over the phone that I could have, and then they didn't translate into taking surveys. So if any of you researchers out there know how to get in contact with dispensaries and take your surveys, talk to me afterwards. But especially from the nonprofits, we got a ton of data. As Jess said, we got pretty ambitious with this survey, which led to a lot of great quantitative data, but a lot of qualitative data as well. So Jess putting together that code book, that was a big one. So a ton of data that is going to be in our different manuscripts. We also hired 2 different research assistants, one from public administration, one from CJ. So we really helped this interdisciplinary theme keep going. So her research assistant helped her with the nonprofit data, and mine helped me with all the dispensary calls. We also applied for 3 additional grants. One of them we did receive, we got $4,200. And one of them, which was over $250,000, we applied for the Institute of Cannabis Research. Unfortunately, we did not get that, but we now know how to turn this project into a 3-year global $100,000 project if we want to, if we can find the funding. So that was a big proposal to put together, but the CRCW and getting this award and going through this process really helped us apply for these other grants. We also purchased a nonprofit contact list, and Jess was very savvy, and she negotiated the use of this list, not just for these projects, but to use this for marketing purposes, to use this for other things in the College of Public Service, because now we have access to all of these nonprofits that we didn't before. A big piece of this was how we were going to distribute these results. So this is not a super theoretical project. This is really policy grounded. I don't know if any of you heard, but actually as of Tuesday, they talked about rescheduling marijuana. Yeah, some of you know. So this is a constant policy update. Does this impact federal illegality? No, but it does impact taxes and things we talked about in these projects actually. So this is a constantly evolving topic. So we really wanted to make sure that we are producing these results and distributing it so people can have these conversations. So we did go to our couple of conferences. She went to our Nova, I went to Western Crim. Western Crim was in Vancouver, so we can say we took this international. And then in a couple of weeks, Jess is gonna present this at CIDR. Shameless plug, CIDR is an interdisciplinary drug and alcohol research conference started by a couple of us professors here. So if you have any interest, you can come join us on May 17th and 18th. We'll have some great research there.
It's right here.
Right here on campus, yes. We also did produce a community report, like Jess was saying. A lot of these organizations are super interested because they know there's cannabis money and they know it could help their mission, it could help their goals. But if they're not having these conversations or don't know how to have these conversations, it kind of provided a slight blueprint in this report. So these organizations were very interested in these results. We actually, as of this week, are in the final proofs of our Journal of Drug Issues article, so we're very excited about that. Our first one kind of looked at our big research question, will you accept cannabis dollars? What do you think about the cannabis industry? We actually found that people didn't find it to be as morally tainted or morally questionable as we thought. A big hurdle is the federal illegality, though. A lot of them are hesitant because it's federally illegal. Could it be enforced? Could they lose donors? Could they lose their status? They're concerned about these things. So they did talk about if the federal illegality status were to change, they might accept cannabis dollars or would be more likely to accept cannabis dollars. And our second journal article is in progress. And this one, we are comparing the cannabis industry to those other morally questionable or tainted industries, such as tobacco, alcohol, pharmaceuticals, and gambling. Kind of seeing, would you accept money from these industries? If so, why? Is it similar to the cannabis industry? And we're seeing some differences based on their mission, who they serve, who their partnerships have been with, and if they just really see cannabis as a different ballgame. So that's something that we are working on currently. Thank you all very much for those of you who looked at our proposal and accepted it. This really gave us the grounding that we needed to explore this. And we've really enjoyed working together and working on this topic, and we'll keep working on it till we can't publish anymore. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, last but not least, in session 3 is Colin McAllister, and I'll just go ahead and put it way up here.
I thought you were going to say that the CIDAR conference has a really great reception.
It might.
It's in the works. We're on some.
I don't have a PowerPoint, but I do have some visual aids here. So my project was called Aeneas in the Underworld, a collaborative music endeavor. And the goal of the CRCW was to produce a professional recording, a documentation of this project, and have it released on a recognized peer-reviewed record label, which I know that there are sometimes costs incurred in academic publishing for books, but it's really bad when it comes to recorded music. You have to bring all the money to the table yourself. Not only would the recording allow us to make a definitive documented version of the work, which was over a decade in development, but also make us much more competitive with seeking out possibilities for live performance, whether grant funded or at universities or contemporary music festivals. And I'm happy to say that we have succeeded on all accounts. A little bit about the work itself. I've been how to put it, maybe a struggling Latin language enthusiast for many years. My brother was a classics major at university, and I've been working with Latin for over 20 years. I've also had a long-standing interest in classical literature, especially from ancient Greece and Rome, and how things like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and the Aeneid of Virgil continue to find resonance in every generation. These works are constantly translated and retranslated. This is the most recent translation of the Aeneid by Shadi Barsh, who's a Guggenheim laureate from the University of Chicago. Interestingly enough, Emily Wilson was awarded a Guggenheim just a couple years ago to translate the Iliad, despite the fact that something like 5 translations of the Iliad have appeared in the last 30 years. So there's obviously a lot of interest on many levels on how these ancient texts continue to respond to our current day conditions. In 2006, this is when this project actually started, believe it or not, I had just returned from a concert tour. I'm a classical guitarist, and I had just returned from a concert tour where I'd commissioned a bunch of very short pieces for guitar. I thought, well, if I can get 20 composers to write for me and play these 20 short pieces, that could be kind of interesting. And it was, and I'd gotten back from that. I was sitting outside with a composer friend of mine on my patio in San Diego. I thought, wow, it'd be really neat to do now for my next thing, a very long piece, like a full concert length work. And it might be cool to somehow bring Roman epic, Latin epic into this. And Chris, who I'm pretty sure also had a martini in his hand, said, oh yeah, and wouldn't it be great if you just recited from the Aeneid in Latin while you played guitar? And so that's where we got to. So the work was composed in stages beginning in 2008, and it was completed in 2018. It was premiered for the first time, the whole version, in 2019 here at the Ed Center for the Arts, with subsequent performances in LA and San Diego. And we had received a handful of small grants from various organizations along the way to help with getting the live performance together, but a recording just seemed prohibitively expensive. The piece itself, Aeneas in the Underworld, is an immersive 1-hour multimedia collaboration between Christopher Adler, who's a composer at the University of San Diego, and myself. The soloist recites the original Latin text from Book 6 of the Aeneid while playing a guitar that is subjected to drastic retuning, preparations, and playing implements. A second guitarist is brought in for Act 2, as well as electronics. And Act 3 features a string quartet. And I even got my wife Barb in the mix. She recorded the voice of Dido, who is Aeneas's spurned lover in the underworld. Might have been a strange choice for domestic relations, but she did a great job with that. And the fellow performers who were on the recording are really fantastic. 4 members of the Colorado Springs Philharmonic here in town, a guitarist from Denver, Russ Callison. We recorded all the instrumental parts in Chapman Recital Hall here at Ent, and the voice parts were done at Studio West in San Diego, where it was also mixed, and it was mastered at New Zone up in Los Angeles. We commissioned a new English translation of the lines from the Aeneid that we were using from Kang Lei, who's a classicist at Colorado College. And we project in the live performance super titles above the stage. So while I'm speaking in Latin, for those who are bereft of Latin, not many, but there's the English translations that appear in Kang's translation above the stage. And we also commissioned some original artwork for the cover. And this is the original here. This was done by a Romanian artist called Ilie Vaduva, who's based in Chicago. And so we did this, this is Aeneas grabbing the golden bough, which is a scene from Book 6. So I was very happy that we were able to use this money to benefit musicians and artists both in our community as well as outside of our community. Although the score, the musical score itself, was largely finished by the time we received the grant, we were able, as part of this process, to make a lot of small changes and revisions in the score, and that was very helpful. And then finally, the project was released on a label called Microfest Records out of Los Angeles. It's available both streaming and on CD. I know, right? The CD version has a 24-page booklet with all the translations, and there's screen printing on the CD itself. This was probably a little bit of a vanity project, but you know, it's the last CD I'm sure that I'll ever do. And it brings, you know, my performing career started in the early 90s, and I was touring with this violin player, and we made all of our money from selling physical objects, CDs and tapes. No one paid us any fees. We made all our money from the sales of these things. So it kind of made me feel nice to come back to that, to have one last CD, and to, especially since, I mean, you know, the Aeneid is 2,000 years old, might as well have a tactile object to represent that. So we haven't sold a lot. If you want one, I get you one for sure. Some additional outcomes. Last year, I edited a book called Music in the Apocalyptic Mode. And it has scholarly essays on the nexus between music and apocalypticism, ranging from medieval settings of the Dies Irae through works by Bach and Telemann, to African-American spirituals and blues, to contemporary music of all stripes, from avant-garde classical to pop and rock. And as a sort of coda to this volume, we included 3 reflections by contemporary composers on how their own creative work engages with notions of apocalypticism. And Chris Adler wrote one of these essays. Book 6 of the Aeneid portrays Aeneas as his journey into the underworld and culminates in Elysium, where he encounters the shade of his deceased father, Anchises, who narrates the future of Rome by enumerating the souls waiting to be reborn as celebrated figures of Roman history to be. This is a revelation of divine mysteries, a retrospective prophecy, which we also call a Vaticinium ex eventu, narrated by otherworldly characters in an unearthly realm. And all of these are literary techniques that are common to apocalyptic literature, the most well-known being, of course, the Revelation of John, the last book of the New Testament. Other outcomes, I gave an invited talk at the Center for the Pre-Modern World at University of Southern California last year on Aeneas in the Underworld. Did a conference presentation at Through a Glass Darkly, which is also a conference here at UCCS that we started. Did a partial performance for the CD release event for San Diego New Music last year. And we have interest from the Classics Department and the Music Department at Harvard University and the University of Chicago on bringing this project potentially out there next year, as well as the Neefnor Festival, which is a contemporary music festival that takes place in the summers in Knoxville, Tennessee. We did have some student benefits, although this wasn't part of the original proposal. Chris Adler, while he was here one time doing recordings, led a student workshop to our composers in the music department on extended techniques for guitar and also extended methods of notation. And in my individual lessons, I had a number of students who were interested as guitarists, and I would assign them brief passages of this to just get them to understand a little bit about how some of this contemporary music works. So I just want to extend again my appreciation to the UCCS Office of Research and Jesse and Lindsay, and of course the faculty who approved this project for a grant. It's allowed us to do something we could not have funded on our own, and I hope will give this project a continued life for years to come. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. That concludes our day of CRCW presentations. If you missed any of the sessions or want to go back and relook at them, they will be on our Office of Research website, research.uccs.edu on the CRCW tab. So thanks so much, everyone.